Welcome everyone, and each one of you, to the Pilates Center and to the Pilates Center Teacher Training Program Formal Lecture Series. I'm Rachel Taylor Segel.
And I'm Amy Taylor Alpers.
And we are the owners for 20-some years now of the Pilates Center. And this is the first time in those years that we have decided to put our whole lecture series on film for you.
That's right. My first experience with Pilates was actually in 1975. I had some friends who were in the Dance Theater of Harlem, and they would come back to where we were living and talk a little bit about this crazy woman who was giving them these odd exercises to do. And I really didn't know what that was. But years later, I learned that that was Kathy Grant. I also had a couple other friends who had studied with her. So she was the first person that I had thought I might connect with. But then Rachel decided to move to New York City, and she had read these articles on Carola Trier that were in the dance magazine series for a number of, over several months, I guess it was.
Yeah, and years before.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so she moved to New York to live with me, and we decided to take Pilates at that point, and honestly are not quite sure how it was that we chose Romana, but I think it might have simply been that she was the one in the phone book that we could get in touch with. So at any rate, we've always been extremely, extremely glad that we just started where it seemed to be the source and no questions, and pretty much just stayed working with Romana and her teachers through the late 80s, like 87 through 89.
Yeah, we would study 3 times a week minimum, come to the studio and do our workouts that were reformer and mat and some optionals before you left the studio. And it wasn't until the studio mysteriously closed one day that we realized how precious what it was we were doing and how precious what we were receiving. And we came to Romana and we said, we want more. We want to teacher train, or we want to at least get as much from you as we possibly can before we leave New York City.
Right. And the man who owned the studio at the time, his name was Wee-Tai Holmes. So we spoke with him and asked if we could have a teacher training program. So they literally kind of threw together a 2-week long program, which basically consisted of us having access to Romana and being able to just kind of sit next to her and observe her really closely and ask her questions and that kind of thing. And as far as we know, that was kind of like the first formal teacher training program that existed. Up till then, pretty much anybody who had taught Pilates really just apprenticed until they fell into being a teacher at that studio. So we did our 2-week-long teacher training program and passed. Whatever that meant at the time, I don't even really remember. But we did get certificates with Romana's signature on them, which in the next several years really turned out to be quite handy.
Very important.
At the same time as we talked to Wee-Tai about taking a teacher training program, I had also asked him how to get equipment and could I buy a reformer. And so I had actually paid him $3,000 for a reformer, and we knew we were going to be moving to Boulder shortly, so I figured, that would be what we would use when we left New York. He was never really quite able to produce that reformer. Similarly to the day when the studio closed, we really don't know what the story was, but we assumed that there was probably some kind of back rent due or something like that. And right after the studio closed, that was when they reopened at Drago's gym. And we were able to find that out by calling Romana on the telephone, because you could still look her up in the phone book and call her. And she said, don't worry, we'll reopen.
Oh, honey. She said, oh, honey, don't worry. I'll let you know when we reopen.
Right. We were like, oh, thank God. Thank God, thank God. So at any rate, we moved to Boulder, and Wee-Tai found another equipment manufacturer, and his reformers were essentially half price. So he said he would get me 2 for the price of 1. And actually only ever really got me 1. So I wrote him and I said, for the $1,500, when we open our studio here in Boulder, we'd like to call it the Pilates Center. use the name Pilates, and he said okay, and that was really how we were able to, all those next 10, 15 years, continue to operate as the Pilates Center, and not really, and no one could really tell us we couldn't, much as they tried. So a year after the training program that we took was in July of 1989, or it ended in July of 1989, and we moved to Boulder in that fall. And I went back to New York in June of 90 and was just taking some lessons with Romana, and she introduced me to a man named Steve Giordano. He happened to walk into the studio with a spine corrector, and I said, Romana, does he build equipment? Because equipment was a little bit hard to come by back then. And she said, oh yeah, and she introduced us to Steve, and I told Steve we were thinking of maybe opening a studio. We weren't sure, and he said, oh, I'd love to come out and build your equipment. And so really that was kind of what enabled us to formally decide we would open a studio, and how we would get our equipment. So Steve came to Boulder and he built all our original first studio's worth of equipment. We still have a couple of those pieces today. And
at the same time, he was helping us put together our teacher training program.
Right.
And simultaneously with Romana and Steve helping Amy and I build the program here in Boulder, Steve and Romana were working with now Sean Gallagher in New York City and building an almost identical training program at the same time.
Right.
And Romana came out, so we started our training program the next year in 91, and Romana came out 3 or 4 times for that first year and a half, and taught the lectures for us, and did some of the exams, and signed her name to the original people who graduated from our training program.
The first group, right.
So she really helped train us to teach the work the way we had been taught the work through her, as close as possible, in our minds still, to how Joe Pilates created the work to be taught. And that was definitely her belief and her stance, that she was going, her commitment, that she was going to keep Joe's work as true as possible to what he envisioned in return to life, and in the many years that she taught for him and with him.
Right, right. And one of the things that we felt so strongly about with Romana, and I think why we resonated so specifically with her, was because she also had been a classical ballet dancer. Both Rachel and I had been ballet dancers as children and up through high school, and then teachers after that, and danced professionally a little bit. And we just are we've always been very appreciative of the idea of form. In ballet, you learn the bar, you learn the way a class goes, and that's the way you do it, and it produces the ultimate effect that it's trying to do. And I think that it's one of the reasons why dancers in general love Pilates, but particularly I think why Romana was, in a way, kind of the right person to carry on the work as a form, being a ballet dancer herself, rather than, for instance, being a choreographer or a modern dancer, or what a lot of the other elders were more inclined to be creators and choreographers.
Improvisers.
Yes,
Right.
yes. But we did feel very strongly that we also had the great fortune of having a couple influences from some of those other elders. So early on, Deborah Robinson Colway came to work with us, and she had been a student of Eve Gentry's, and that very much infiltrated our style of teaching, not so much the method or the exercises we were teaching, but our urge kind of to go more deeply into the work. We felt when we established our studio, we loved Pilates, but we really wanted to teach it with a little more depth. And then later on, Kara Reeser and Kim Hirosh both taught and took our training programs, and they had been students and teachers or teachers for Kathy Grant. And so we felt that, our very classical lineage was also influenced by some of the other lineages as well, which I think gave our program, and still does to this day, quite a bit more depth and substance.
And then around 1993, Amy and I were on our own.
Right.
And we taught the lectures twice a year, full out, for another I don't know, 7 years or 8 years before we took one of our teachers and then another one of our teachers and trained them to teach the lectures as well. Through all that time, it was done here in-house in Boulder at the Pilates Center, and it wasn't until, I don't know, maybe 5 years ago, 6 years ago, that we grew our teacher training program to then create the master's program for all the teachers who had been through our training program or others by this time and who wanted to delve deeper and who wanted to do more sophisticated, refined studying. And so after the master's program, we developed we licensed our teacher training program to a small handful, select people, I think at the beginning, around the world, to be able to teach the Pilates Center teacher training program around the world, so that people who couldn't come to us here in Boulder could take our training program elsewhere. And from
it's like the Pilates Center is a little bit of a microcosm of the way the industry has gone. It was small and it was local, and people would travel to take a training program, and then slowly the industry expanded enough that people were getting more used to the idea of having it be more convenient, you know, and so we were always a little bit slow at wanting to expand, but, you know, eventually discovered to reach more people, because our mission at the Pilates Center has always been to heal the world through Pilates. Just a small little mission, heal the world. You know, and we just began to see, obviously, we'll have to expand, and we'll have to allow some of our graduates who by that point had been teaching for many, many years to take on the job of offering our teacher training program. And that's why putting this all on film is such a huge deal for Rachel and me. You know, it's like our baby, and we're putting it on film now, so it's a big deal.
Yes. And so after we selected a few licensed teacher trainers around the world, we also developed host studios who could do the apprenticeship part of our teacher training program, and we would come to them with the lectures and the examinations. So we would still keep our hand in, and they would still have part of the source or the mothership. And along that time, we developed manuals for our training program, as well as what was I going to say?
Well, they're more like workbooks.
Workbooks.
We're very
Thank
clear.
you.
They're more like workbooks.
Yes.
Which hopefully you have right now in
Yes,
your hand.
you will be using in the next
You'll
hours.
be using them, exactly. Well, we determined also about that same time that, you know, we needed to create a bridge program for people who wanted to take our training program, and then already had quite a lot of experiences as being a professional teacher. There's always been the distinction between sort of the classical lineage and the other lineages of Pilates, and so sometimes there'd be people who, you know, had been teaching a long time but really wanted to discover the classical work as well. At the same time, we kind of figured out, all right, then we need to create an intermediate program, which is sort of the first half of what was the program.
And gives you 450 hours and permits you to take the PMA certification exam.
Exactly. And it's pretty, it's comprehensive, but only up through about an intermediate level. But comes in about equal with a lot of the other teacher training programs that are out there in terms of what's required to start your career. And then still the whole advanced program still exists. And then we added also just mentoring. A lot of people were starting to want to do something on a more personal level, had decided a teacher that they really wanted to work with, and so that became another thing that we could offer. So over the course of the 20 plus years of the program, it has really evolved and expanded and produced lots of little children. And now we have studios, probably about 15 studios between the licensed and the host and the local studio, and we're pretty excited about that.
So a couple other things that we've done in this, what seems to us, vast history of Amy and Rachel in the Pilates
because
Center.
we're still way too young to have had this business for that long.
Thank you. Was in 2002, Kevin Bowen, who was the president of the Pilates Method Alliance at the time, sent to us Adams Media, which is a big publishing company, to write a book. And we wrote the Everything Pilates book, which we wrote as a textbook for our students or other students and teachers of the work, as well as an understanding of the industry, how to find a good Pilates teacher, what makes a good Pilates teacher, what makes a good Pilates teacher training program, how to do some work at home and what you might need, etc. So we wrote that book in 2002. And then the latest, biggest thing for us is that with the changes in the industry, we were finding it more and more difficult to tell our graduates where to get equipment. And finally, Kenny Endelman came to us from Balanced Body and said, I have for years been wanting to make equipment for you. Let's do it now. And so we worked for over 2 years, 2 to 3 years, to come up with centerline equipment, which now we can happily say to our graduates, if you want to buy equipment, centerline equipment it's the best. It's based off of Joe's original dimensions. It's smooth and feeds into the body the way we think Joe must have wanted the equipment to do, based on having felt those original pieces of equipment in the Pilates studio in New York.
It also really enables the flow that is such a hallmark of the classic work. And that was where we were seeing a tremendous struggle with a lot of the other equipment, which was getting bigger and a little heavy, and the parts were getting heavy, and you couldn't really just work through your workout without running up against struggles. So yeah, our center line is top notch. We love it.
And I think that underlying all of what we've done, including our mission to heal the world with Pilates, is return to life. And every time we ask ourselves, well, should we do this, or should we change this, or should we add this, we always go back and we read Return to Life, and we think, as best we can, what Joe wanted his work to create and facilitate in the human body. And it's always been our path to, as best we can, teach that work the way Ramana taught us, the way Joe talks about it in Return to Life, the way we see on the old films, the archival films of Joe working with other clients, and actually his own words in those films. And it led us into the belief that each teacher must come to that, must feel that themselves in their own body, which is why performance of the work is so critical to us in our training program, and will develop themselves as their own teacher using their own strengths, their own history, their own
kind of intuitive
gifts to be a very unique teacher of a work that is phenomenally strong, full-bodied in theory as well as in action.
And that's why our program for so long has always required that everybody know the entire system, from very basic movements all the way to the most advanced, because until you see that really advanced material, you really don't know what it is you're actually trying to teach in footwork. So we're committed to that, and we're going to cover every single exercise in this filming. And in addition to, that is the form, that is the choreography, these are the exercises. We are extremely committed to teachers developing their truly innate abilities, truly trying to pull out of an individual the teacher within, versus trying to make carbon copies of ourselves, So I think that that's one of the things that our program has always stood for, is that you can't teach this work unless you're willing to go the journey yourself and explore your own process, and and actually return to life through Pilates. So then I think maybe a little bit about the Trademark. So Steve came out here and he worked with us from 1990 through 1991, 92. He was the person who brought Sean Gallagher into the industry, kind of with this idea, a great idea, which was that maybe, the medical community could get a little more involved, and possibly we would even be able to bill insurance for Pilates under a physical therapist, that kind of thing. So, he was helping to, Romana and Sean established that same program as ours back in New York. And as far as we know, honestly, as a formal program where somebody could literally start at A and end at Z, take an exam and pass, possibly the very first 2 programs in existence. We'll find that out over the years if somebody comes forth and says something else, right? So Sean came in and bought the trademark from Wee Tai Home probably somewhere in 1992, and that was when he started calling people, trying to defend the name Pilates Studio and the word Pilates and Pilates method. And he did call us and tell us we couldn't continue to use the word Pilates, but we sort of had
about every year.
Yeah, we get this call periodically from him, and we'd say, okay,
send us some paperwork.
And we'll
never did.
But he never really did, and so it went on like that for about 7-8 years, and then the trademarks kind of came to a head, and the case was actually going to court, and Sean and his lawyers came out here and deposed us for several days to ask us, what we knew to be true about Pilates and what the word meant and why we were still calling ourselves the Pilates Center when we weren't affiliated with the Pilates Studio people. And then I actually ended up going to New York and testifying in the court case, telling basically that same story I just mentioned about buying the piece of equipment that was never really produced, and therefore being able to use the name for what was owed me. And it was, it was sad because we really appreciated the idea that there is a form and that it should be protected and that there's a name to this form. It wasn't necessarily defended as the way we would have liked it to be defended, and the truth was, it really was already out of anybody's control. But it was disappointing on some level to see that the word became generic after that. And then the industry changed dramatically at that point. It became a completely different industry. Up till then, it had been a few people in New York and a few scattered people up through the 80s. And then in the 90s, when we established, there was a little bit more activity, but still a lot of people underground because of the trademark. And then
afraid to use the word Pilates.
Afraid to use the word Pilates, right. And then in October of 2000 was when the word was deemed generic, and within months, it was as if really, truly some floodgates had burst and massive amounts of people entered the industry, and it became quite a different industry. And I think to this day, we're still somewhat recovering from that as an industry. I always talk to people about how young this industry really is, and that we're very, very much at the beginnings of it. And there's still a tremendous amount of work that needs to be done to create it as a much more professional entity that has respect and could be, easily licensed and have a few more of the benefits that a lot of more professional careers do. And Rachel and I have been actively involved with the PMA since the very moment of the loss of the trademark, because in December of 2000, there was a gathering of people started by Kevin Bowen and Colleen Glenn at the Power Pilates studio, in New York, and that was the very first little beginnings of the PMA. So we have always been there, have always been involved. I was on the board for a long time. We sat on the certification exam board. Rachel's currently on the
Commission for Certification.
Right, so we're always actively involved in setting standards, raising standards, trying to up the professionalism. Our school is probably the first school to ever be licensed by the state as a formal vocational program. That is becoming something that needs to be occurring more readily, and the next step is to work on national accreditation, and that will be happening soon, maybe by the time you read this or watch this.